Hello and welcome to my channel. In this episode, we're going to look at the establishment and early years of the Jamestown Colony, the first permanent English settlement in North America. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, then let's get to it. Okay, so before we get into the details of the Jamestown Colony, let's begin with a brief overview of the broader context surrounding its founding. See, England had long been interested in establishing a settlement in North America, but had not done so yet because they had other places that they preferred to send their would-be colonists like, their own darn nasty little island prison. But in the early 17th century, a few English businessmen convinced Queen Elizabeth I that establishing a colony in North America would be a good idea. Why? Well, for one thing, they thought it might help counter the growing Spanish Empire, which was encroaching further and further into the Western Hemisphere. Also, they hoped to find gold and other valuable resources and also exploit the fur trade. Finally, there was religion. These guys were all about converting the heathens. So in 1606, Elizabeth granted a charter to a group of investors, the Virginia Company of London, giving them permission to establish a colony in North America. Now, the company was a joint stock company, which meant that investors bought shares of stock in the company, and the profits from the colony would go to the shareholders. And the people who actually ran the colony were called the Virginia Company of London. They appointed a governor to oversee the colony, and they set about the task of establishing the first permanent English settlement in North America. Now, when planning the colony, they decided that the most important thing was to make sure that it was defensible. So they chose a location on the northeast bank of the James River in present-day Virginia, near what is now Williamsburg. The site was ideal because it was on a peninsula, and that meant that the colony would be protected from attack on three sides by water. Plus, the river was deep enough for ships to dock there. That's right, kids. We love us some defensible locations here on this channel. And this one was no exception. The colonists arrived on May 14, 1607, on three ships called Susan Constant, Godspeed, and Discovery. There were 105 men and boys in all. And they quickly got to work on building their fort, which they initially called James Fort, but later became known as Jamestown or James City. The fort was made of wood and earth, and it was surrounded by a moat. And within the fort, they built houses for themselves and stores for their supplies. They also planted crops and started hunting and fishing to sustain themselves. Now, the site they chose was definitely a swamp, and it was full of mosquitoes and other biting insects. Plus, the water was contaminated with salt and other impurities. So finding fresh water was a challenge. And the soil was poor and the hunting was bad. So food was scarce. And on top of that, they had brought rats with them on the ship that then multiplied in the stores and spread disease among the colonists. So basically, life in Jamestown was pretty tough in the beginning. But it got even tougher when the local Native Americans attacked them. See, the people who lived in this area were part of a group of tribes known as the Powhatan Confederacy. And the two main tribes were the Powhatan and the Chickahominy. The chief of the Powhatan Confederacy was named Wahensanok, but he was better known by his English name, Chief Powhatan. Now, the English had actually been in contact with the Powhatan people before they settled in Jamestown, and they had generally good relations with them. But once the English started encroaching on Powhatan land and taking resources that the tribe relied on, things got tense. And soon after the Jamestown colonists arrived, they found themselves at war with the Powhatan people. In 1609, a group of about 500 Powhatan warriors attacked the settlement. The English were able to defend the fort, but it was close. And this conflict would be just the first of many battles between the English and the Powhatan over the next century. You see, both sides had good reasons for wanting the land. For the English, it was a matter of survival. As we've already discussed, the land was not particularly hospitable, and the colonists were struggling to grow enough food to sustain themselves. For the Powhatan, it was a matter of protecting their way of life. The English were a formidable opponent, and the Powhatan knew that if they didn't fight back, the English would continue to encroach on their land and eventually drive them out. As the years went on, the fighting between the two sides became more and more intense. And it seemed like neither side was willing to back down. This conflict would have a major impact on the future of Jamestown. In fact, the colony nearly failed in 1610 due to a combination of starvation, disease, and conflict with the natives. Only 60 of the original 500 colonists survived. But despite these hardships, the colony was not abandoned. Instead, it would go on to become one of the most important settlements in colonial America. But how did that happen? What made Jamestown successful when other colonies had failed? Well, it's likely a combination of factors. First, Jamestown was located in a strategic place, right on the coast and close to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. This made it an ideal location for trade and commerce. Second, the colony was well led. While the early years of Jamestown were marked by infighting and chaos, things began to turn around in the early 1620s under the leadership of a man named George Yeardley. He introduced a number of reforms that helped stabilize the colony and set it on the path to prosperity. Third, agriculture. The introduction of tobacco as a cash crop really saved the day for Jamestown. Tobacco was a highly profitable crop that grew well in the climate of Virginia. And it quickly became one of the most important exports of the colony. And finally, the labor system. Initially, the colonists tried to run the colony themselves, but they quickly realized that they needed help. They had no experience in things like farming or building. So they turned to indentured servitude to get the job done. Under this system, people would come to Jamestown and work for 7 years in exchange for their freedom. At the end of their indenture, they would receive a plot of land and a certain amount of money. This system helped to build up the colony and provide a labor force that was essential to its success. By the mid-1600s, Jamestown was a thriving settlement with a growing population and a strong economy. It was the center of the tobacco trade and had become one of the most important colonies in colonial America. And while the colony's success was due to a combination of factors, it's hard to ignore the role that exploitation played in its rise to prominence. The English exploited the resources of the land and the labor of the indigenous people. And as the colony grew, that exploitation only increased. And that's where we're gonna pick up next time on episode 3, when we explore the development of the plantation system in colonial Virginia. If you'd like to help support the show, then you can join my patrons over at Patreon, or you can just hit that subscribe button. More than any other city in America, Jamestown, Virginia is where our nation's story began. Jamestown served as the colonial capital from 1616 until 1699. Here are 10 things that happened first in Jamestown. Number 10, the first representative assembly. In 1619, the Virginia Company sent over 60 men to become the first English settlers in North America at Jamestown. And while they were setting up their settlement, one of the members, John Fear, went off to explore what he called Bloody Marsh, now known as Cape Henry, where he saw the Dutch ship arriving with 30 settlers who had established a settlement at nearby Henricastown, now known as Fort Monroe. They both claimed the land for their respective countries. But when Fear returned to Jamestown, he realized that they needed a better way to govern themselves than relying on the far-off English monarchy. So on July 30th, 1619, in the first representative assembly in North America, the burgesses or elected representatives met with the governor to pass laws for the colony. This set the stage for the American ideal of government by the people. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. No. 9. The first recorded African slaves arrive. During their first representative assembly, the burgesses passed a law that would have an enormous impact on the future of not only Jamestown, but America itself. On August 26, 1619, they passed a law allowing for the importation of Africans to serve as indentured servants, which led to the arrival of 20 so-called black slaves in August 1619. While it isn't known how many Africans would have been free before the transatlantic slave trade, these men were the first to arrive in British North America and serve as property rather than indentured servants. As such, this event marked the beginning of race-based slavery in the colony and eventually the United States. However, it wasn't long before the colony was facing some serious problems. Number 8. Starvation and disease. After their first year, less than half of the original 60 settlers were still alive. Disease, hunger, and poor leadership almost caused the colony to fail during its first few years. In 1608, the supply ship arrived late, leaving them to fend for themselves against the harsh Virginia winter. Most of the colonists were starving, and the ones who didn't starve often died from exposure and disease. Out of the 500 total settlers that had arrived by 1609, only 60 remained. It seemed like all hope was lost until Lord Delaware arrived as the new governor and with food and supplies, saving the colony from starvation. And fortunately, this wouldn't be the last time the colony faced starvation. Number 7. The Indian Massacre. Under the rule of Governor William Berkeley, relations between the English settlers and the native peoples became increasingly tense. The Powhatan Confederacy, a group of more than 30 Native American tribes led by Chief Powhatan, attempted to peacefully coexist with the colonists, teaching them how to grow corn and survive in the New World. But after the colonists murdered Chief Powhatan's brother, relations soured and fighting broke out. In March 1622, while most of the colonists were unarmed and celebrating Easter Sunday, 300 warriors attacked and killed 347 colonists across 13 different settlements. Jamestown was saved by a young man named John Rolfe, who rushed to warn the town after seeing the smoke from the nearby Henricastown settlement that had been attacked. While this attack devastated the colony, causing the survivors to abandon many of the settlements up and down the James River, the colony of Jamestown lived on. And now for No. 6. But first, if you're enjoying this video, go ahead and click that like button. If you've learned something about Jamestown, consider subscribing. No. 6. Bacon's Rebellion. Relations between Governor William Berkeley and the colonists continued to deteriorate due to high taxes and Berkeley's refusal to retaliate against the Susquehannock tribe after they raided a frontier settlement. In 1676, Nathaniel Bacon Jr. led a rebellion of about 1,000 colonists who attacked the Susquehannock village, killing and scalping many of the natives. When Governor Berkeley learned of this attack, he put a stop to it and arrested Bacon, charging him with treason. In response, Bacon and his followers burned Jamestown to the ground on May 1676, killing Berkeley's brother, who was also the royal governor's deputy. While Bacon ultimately died of dysentery, the rebellion devastated the colony. It took 3 years for the town to be rebuilt, and it would never recover its status as a commercial center. Number 5. The Green Dragon. Before the town was burned down during Bacon's rebellion, it was destroyed by fire once again. In 1677, a fire broke out in the middle of the night and destroyed a large portion of the town, including the State House and church. But just 4 years later, another fire broke out in the powder magazine, spreading to other buildings and destroying 2/3 of the town, including the homes of the royal governor and lieutenant governor. This was the worst disaster in the colony's history. And after the town was rebuilt, the citizens wanted to prevent further damage. In 1684, they organized a volunteer fire department with the first fire engine arriving in 1686. That fire engine was brought here and housed in this building, now known as the Green Dragon, which sits on the oldest continuously occupied street in America. Number 4. Middle Plantation becomes Williamsburg. With the fires and Bacon's rebellion, the town of Jamestown was in sharp decline. Its infrastructure was in ruins and most of the people had left. In 1698, another fire broke out and destroyed more than 1/3 of the town, including the custom houses and warehouses. At this point, it was clear to the colony's leaders that the town of Jamestown could no longer serve as the colonial capital. In 1699, the General Assembly voted to move the capital to the town of Middle Plantation, which was situated along the York River midway between the mouth of the river and the fall line. Middle Plantation had been founded in 1653 and was chosen because of its central location within the colony. In addition to being closer to the center of population, the site had natural deep water access unlike Jamestown, whose port had silted in over time. The town was renamed Williamsburg in 1699 in honor of King William III. Number 3. The public goal. While Williamsburg was officially established in 1699, it wasn't until 1705 that the first public jail in America was built. This structure, known as the public gaol, was built in 1705 to replace an earlier jail that had been built in 1643 near the courthouse. In its nearly 100 years of operation, the prison saw some gruesome things. During the Revolutionary War, Loyalist prisoners were held here and mistreated by the Patriot Guards. In 1788, a yellow fever epidemic broke out and sick prisoners were moved into the jail to quarantine them from the rest of the city. However, the guards refused to care for the prisoners and instead chained them inside with little ventilation or sanitation. This resulted in dozens of deaths and the surviving prisoners tearing down the building to use it as a latrine. Today, the reconstructed building serves as a museum. Number 2. Freedom is bought. In 1776, Virginia was one of the first colonies to declare independence from Great Britain. However, the road to freedom was paved with many sacrifices. During the Revolutionary War, the Virginia capital was moved several times to escape the advancing British Army, finally settling in present-day Charlottesville. But in 1781, the war came to a head at Yorktown, where French and American forces trapped the British Army under the command of General Cornwallis. Knowing the siege was hopeless, Cornwallis sent word to American General George Washington that he was willing to surrender his army if they would guarantee fair treatment in exchange. However, Washington demanded that the British surrender without any conditions. Eventually, the terms were agreed upon, and on October 19, 1781, British forces surrendered, effectively ending the Revolutionary War and securing American independence. No. 1. Monticello. While the capital had been moved to Williamsburg in 1699, people continued to live in Jamestown and farm the area for many years afterward. One of those people was Thomas Jefferson. He purchased 13 acres in Jamestown in 1709 and built his first home, Shadwell, where he lived from 1714 to 1723. However, his father had passed away and left him a large estate known as Monticello. And in 1726, Thomas Jefferson returned to his family home in Shadwell and lived with his father until his death in 1745. Thomas Jefferson then sold Shadwell and moved into Monticello, where he spent the remainder of his life. So what should I talk about next? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. The year is 1609 and a supply ship has been due to arrive in Jamestown for almost a year now. But as spring comes and the settlers' food stores dwindle, it becomes clear that no rescue is coming. This is the story of the starving time. When the first European settlers arrived in Jamestown in 1607, they were greeted by the local indigenous people who taught them how to cultivate corn, find edible plants and fish, and hunt in the area. Despite this help, the settlers almost starved to death during their first winter, but they survived thanks to supplies brought over from England in the summer of 1608. With their newfound knowledge of the land and supplies from England, the settlers thrived. The colony was making money by harvesting and exporting tobacco, and things were looking up. But what went wrong? Well, a lot actually. First of all, an insect called the tobacco beetle showed up and nearly destroyed every single plant in the colony. To make matters worse, one of the settlers, a man named John Farr, decided to take advantage of the colony's struggles and steal some tobacco seeds. He planned to sell the seeds to rival companies so they could grow tobacco in their colonies and undercut Jamestown. When Farr was caught, he was put on trial and sentenced to death. In his final speech before his execution, he called all the male settlers cowards and said that they would all die miserable deaths if they didn't leave the colony. And to make matters even worse, a hurricane destroyed most of the food stores in the settlement. By 1609, the colony was in sharp decline and knew that if they were going to make it through the upcoming winter, they had to get more supplies from England. So they sent a man named George Percy back to England to ask the Virginia Company to send more supplies, like a lot more. Meanwhile, the rest of the settlers prepared for winter by building new houses out of brick. They also built a fort to protect themselves from attacks by the indigenous peoples. But when Percy returned with the supply ship in early 1610, he found that things hadn't gone well for the colony. The ship he'd arrived on was supposed to be carrying 450 colonists to join the struggling settlement. But instead of finding 450 eager settlers ready to start a new life in America, Percy found just 60 men, barely clinging to life. It turned out that after Farr's execution, things went really downhill. The colony had lost most of its food in the hurricane, and the surviving members of the colony became desperate. Eventually, cannibalism started to take place. There's a letter written by one of the settlers, Robert Hent, to Sir Thomas Dale, the leader of the colony, where he begs Dale to come save him and the other starving settlers, saying that they are, quote, in a very low and lamentable pass. Hent goes on to say that the remaining settlers are too weak to work or defend the colony and that the only hope for their survival is that Dale arrives soon. After reading this, Dale made the decision to abandon the colony. He left with about 200 of the healthiest men to go find help while the rest waited for rescue. But there was a problem because everyone in the colony was too weak to move or do anything. Really, cannibalism had taken such a hold that some of the men couldn't even walk. So while Dale and the others left to try to find help, those who were left behind were basically waiting to die. And here's where things get really dark. While Dale and the others were gone, 2 ships arrived carrying the new settlers who had answered the call for help. But when they got there, they found that many of the original settlers had died, and the survivors had resorted to cannibalism. Even though the new settlers tried to care for the survivors, many of them still died. Out of the 215 people who had signed on to the voyage, only 65 survived. Meanwhile, the men who had gone to find help, including Thomas Dale, ended up wandering around the countryside for weeks without any food. Eventually, they stumbled upon a group of indigenous people who took them in and gave them food. They stayed with this group for a little while, learning about the land and how to survive off of it. Then Dale eventually came to an agreement with the local chief to build a new settlement nearby. As for the ships that had brought the new settlers, they, quote, refused to stay, end quote, leaving those who had survived the journey to fend for themselves. So once again, the settlers had no choice but to rely on the kindness of the indigenous people for their survival. In the meantime, the indigenous people who had helped the settlers so much when they first arrived in the area weren't happy with the way Europeans were treating their land. They wanted the Europeans to know that they weren't doing enough to make amends for the destruction that the colony had brought to their way of life. The chief of one of the tribes demanded that the Europeans give them 2,000 coats, 2,000 bushels of corn, and 2,000 pairs of stockings. If they didn't get these items, the chief threatened to kill all the Europeans. To make matters worse, a smallpox epidemic broke out among the indigenous people, killing many of them. Some historians believe that the Europeans had actually given them blankets infected with smallpox, hoping to wipe out the tribes. While all of this was going on, the settlers finally finished building their new village and named it Henricus, after the local chief. But the peace didn't last long. One day, a group of English soldiers arrived demanding that the settlers give them food and supplies. When the settlers refused, the soldiers attacked them. After fighting back, the settlers realized that they couldn't win the battle, so they fled into the forest. There they lived for months, hunting and gathering food. Eventually, the soldiers gave up the chase and the settlers returned to Henricus. But life at the settlement wasn't good. There wasn't enough food for everyone, and the settlers were constantly on the lookout for the English soldiers who might return at any moment. So a group of them decided to flee south to a place where they could be safe. Along the way, they met up with a group of friendly indigenous people who guided them to safety. These indigenous people welcomed the settlers and shared their food and resources. In turn, the settlers taught the indigenous people how to use metal tools and weapons. A few years later, a group of explorers found the abandoned settlement of Henricus and were surprised to find that most of the settlers were gone. They eventually found the settlers living among the indigenous people, and many of them chose to stay with the tribe rather than return to England. In the end, the starving time was a terrible experience for the settlers. They lost almost everything, including their lives in some cases. But it was also an important part of history. It showed the settlers how difficult it was to survive in the New World, and it taught them the importance of respecting the indigenous people who had lived there for centuries. If you enjoyed this video, then check out this one next, and thank you for watching.